Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm assuming you're all online with us here. Welcome to the Conservation, Regeneration in Decline discussion this afternoon. And today, if we can have the next slide, please, Patrick. We've got a fairly tight 45-minute session. We're hoping to get some thoughts out onto the table about conservation and regeneration in the current age, and especially living with COVID. Hopefully we'll have some time for some questions later on. Please do put your questions in the Q&A session, which should be at the bottom of your screen if you click on Q&A. And we are recording the session, and the recordings will be available on the awards website next week. And if you have a look in the chat box, there will be a link to the recording. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by some guest panelists who entered the awards, and one of whom will win later on at 5:30, when I hope you can join us as well. So I'd like to welcome Amy from a very interesting project down on the south coast in Southsea to preserve, I think, some 18th century coastal fortifications. Also joining us is Carl Jordan, who was responsible near Liverpool Street Station for leading a project to convert some old stables into a new Premier Inn hub. Then we've got James King, Director of King and Drury, a very interesting project down again on the south coast at Bognor Regis, and bringing an area of Bognor Regis back to its 1960s heyday. We then have John T. Ashworth from Bicester Motion, and very interesting project there to combine a new automotive industry with the refurbishment or restoration of a World War II airfield. And last but not least, we have Reese from SWJ Consulting, and a very interesting project at a very old tower, St George's Tower in Oxford, and an innovative structural solution to keep the place open and to keep the integrity of this existing structure. So without further ado, if I could start off really with sharing what I hope is a slightly provocative thought for the day with you all, and you can read it on the slide, but I'll run through it. I'm very conscious of, for example, the National Heritage Lottery Fund. I'll just have to make sure I've got that around the right way. No, it's around the wrong way. The National Lottery Heritage Fund has, I think, 6 objectives at the moment, which it's prioritising, underlined by environmental sustainability. Interestingly, the 6 priorities, which include inclusion, economy, well-being, the local area, skills and organisational resilience, to me don't really mention conservation of the heritage assets. It's sort of hidden in there, and I'm interested in whether this focus on place and well-being as social value will lead to a decline in specialist heritage skills and techniques. And I'm also interested in the thought that I heard the other day that we need to focus really on the well-being of people, the NHS and local jobs, and not on derelict old buildings. And that was a very interesting thought to me. And I'm wondering, are they right? They can't be right, can they? Is there a win-win? Is there a different future together? So that was my thought for the day, to start things off. And what I'd like to do now is we've got a little poll to run through, which I'll ask Patrick to bring up on the screen. And I'd like you to have a vote on each of those, or on one of those items. And if you have a look, we've got 4 questions. The first one, as you can see from my thought from the day, is, well, we need to focus on the well-being of people in the NHS, not derelict old buildings. Sector's doing okay. We don't need to do anything different about it. A different tack really in terms of great opportunities for young people to bring them into this sector, but there's no real infrastructure to support them as they move through and as they come into the sector. And another thought again, the new world of commuter back to the community, where people are staying in their communities, and staycations actually will feed an amazing new renaissance in both conservation and regeneration. So I'm very keen to understand your thoughts on that, and I don't know how we're getting on with the voting. Here we go. Well, not surprisingly, really. I think probably good that we need to focus on well-being of people. Didn't get any marks. Sector is doing okay. Yeah, so we do need to do something different. And then quite an interesting split between the ability to bring people in and actually amazing new renaissance. So I think perhaps if I can move to our panelists now to have a response to that. Who shall I choose first? Reece, perhaps from your perspective, how do you see this new renaissance that people are keen on?
It's an interesting one for me because there are certain things that are being valued, being reused, perhaps might have been neglected before. We're looking at one of the projects we're doing at the moment is the refurbishment of a local public house that was once deemed unviable, but is now being turned into a community asset for the whole community to use. They're not only using it as a pub, they're using it as a post office, they're using it as a community centre for various groups, and making that a multi-purpose space fit for purpose has been an interesting challenge for us.
And does anybody else? I mean, perhaps coming to James, are you seeing a similar thing in terms of the commercial viability being rejuvenated, really?
Yeah, well, certainly the project that we've put in is down in Bognor Regis, and anyone down on the south coast has probably seen a massive influx of the London market during sort of COVID coming down to, the screen's moving around, coming down, and that investment, being spent down by the sea for second homes, second apartments, and certainly the project that we've been doing, that is a huge market for the people that have been buying down there, and then that's spread out further to, local businesses, new sort of shops and local baristas opening up where before, that market wasn't necessarily there, certainly in Bognor Regis. But, everywhere around here on the south coast, the property market has been crazy over the last year with everyone coming down. So, of course, you've got listed buildings that people might not have touched before down here, but, the London market have got the opportunity to come down and spend the money on these buildings that might not necessarily have been done, left to, the local market. So, yeah, there's no question that it's a positive outcome on heritage and regeneration.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think it's very true. We're seeing, some coastal regeneration work. It's interesting how a lot of it is around the coast. I think there was a recent opportunity on the Kent coast for Westbrook Lodger, and I think the client was actually saying that before COVID it didn't stack up financially, it wasn't viable, they were going to sell it, it's right on the seafront, and now they want to rejuvenate it as a community asset. So I think that's very a very common thing at the moment. Amy, perhaps I could come to you as well and ask you how you think we can actually encourage people to enjoy and understand the assets that we've got amongst us.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, particularly ever since following the COVID lockdowns, from a local government perspective, we certainly noticed an increase in people visiting the areas. People generally want to spend more time outside now after they were restricted through having to stay indoors, and they're willing to take more time outside to explore all of these heritage and historic assets that we are in possession of. So I think it's really important that we do try and maintain these I think as well, to help with like the regeneration and getting people outside, we perhaps need to look at ways to get the younger generation outside as well as the older generation, because the older generation are probably more than happy to stand by, read a public information board, but for the younger generation, it might be something that needs to be publicised more widely online, or with the information that's publicised on sites, we could use QR codes, which links to further information for those that are really interested, and that might also help grab the attention of other young people and trying to introduce them into the conservation and heritage area, I think
it's a really good point. There's something actually, John T, I was going to ask you in terms of Bicester, because you could say that, okay, World War II airfield, how can that be relevant to somebody growing up who's maybe 6 or 7 or 8 today? And also picking on Bicester Motion, I know there's an issue in the classic car market, for example, where the cars that your dad used to have are actually, the people growing up now, cars from the 1930s, 40s and 50s are sort of getting less relevant. I'm interested in your view on, how do we make these things relevant?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think sort of just picking on the whole principle of repurposing of what was an RAF airfield, I think we're seeing such decline and loss of what were fantastic live operational airfields to becoming residential sites. And what we've tried to do at Bicester Heritage and Bicester Motion is create a new purpose for the site. And what we found is that the introduction of the historic car market, as well as our aviation business, we were able to bring life to the site. So now we've got 40 buildings restored. We've got the historic hangars in use as events venues, classic car storage. It's all about repurposing and diversification. And I think there are more and more sites that this could be done at. And I hope that with COVID, it'll bring that opportunity. And certainly with Bicester Heritage, we open our doors several times of the year for 4,000 to 7,000 visitors over a weekend. And they range from young children to young families and adults and of all ages, not just to see the cars. They're here for the building. They're here to understand the heritage and to see the planes taking off on a grass airfield, which is just simply fantastic.
Yeah, that's a good point. And do you think it's about storytelling? If we can come back to Amy, perhaps, in terms of younger people, is it about what's the best way of engaging them?
Yeah, I think storytelling would be a great way to do it. I mean, for example, at Long Curtain Moat, I think one of our pretty cool facts is that it would have been one of the last places that Lord Nelson himself would have stood. So I think people who are really into their history and being able to go to that place, stand in the exact spot where he stood and look out and see what he last saw, his last viewings on land. I mean, being able to put yourself back into history in itself almost makes it more accessible for the future. You'll be able to relive and appreciate what has already happened in the past, and it allows us to appreciate where we are today, really.
What we try and do at Bicester is try not to make the site a time capsule. We try to say, well, yes, it has its history and we can celebrate that. We can have planes taking off from the grass airfields, but also there's a next chapter in this site, and what that might be is quite an exciting thing as well. And it's getting that balance right of maintaining the history, but also finding preservation through new uses and opportunities.
Yeah, it's about placemaking, isn't it? Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's a key thing, isn't it? It's we've probably all heard the thing of, well, yes, I went to the Science Museum when I was 8 with my school, so I've done that. And I think we've got to keep these things moving, haven't we? We've got to keep them churning, keep them fresh. So good. Well, I mean, moving slightly differently, actually, Carl, if perhaps I could come to you in terms of bringing young people into the industry, and how your company is looking at bringing in people and developing their skills. I think you're on mute, Carl.
Yeah, I suppose, especially over this last sort of 12 months, I think there's common knowledge that everyone's appreciated what's around them. I think the key point that you made there was about moving forward with the times, but also remembering the history of your place and leaving a legacy. And I think definitely younger generation is probably akin to social media and different ways of communication, which is fine. But definitely during the pandemic, I think Amy touched on it. They also appreciated what's around them, local trade, local business, appreciating the landscape, appreciating the culture and history. And I think we have definitely seen a change in the times of the last 12 months of a vested interest in the trade background in particular, that there's buildings around us that will develop over years, but also remember what the historical buildings are about. So in our company, we try and promote the youth coming in, because youth brings resurgence, energy, brings new ideas, brings with it a new lease of life, but also definitely over the last 12 months, it brings an appreciation, which I think has fed up through generations now and through the age, which definitely has helped the culture in this country.
Yeah. And so are you seeing people coming into the trades which potentially are dying out, the established?
Yeah, so like the stonemason trades, brick trades, even if we went to some of the trades like plumbing and electrical, all the sort of key trades that are, even joinery, craftsman trades, we're seeing a resurgence definitely in that. And why this? Because of the 12 months, I think the last 12 months has had an impact and an effect on it. We definitely have seen a vested interest, an increase in interest of youth into these particular trades. And it's probably down to the industry too, that there is a lot more promotion there. I'm probably going against my feelings on social media. Social media is good. It's actually good for PR, but it can have its downfalls. The downfalls probably has been realised during the pandemic, that basic communication is key for us all to have good well-being and mental health. But also the upside of good PR and good social media has helped the youth realise that there's a lot more to the world, a lot more to this construction industry, and it's opened itself up, I definitely feel, in the last 12 months.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's definitely a connection, isn't there, between the well-being and actually doing and creating, and using your hands and your brain to create, and you're creating a legacy. I think probably we all navigate.
I think that creativity. Yeah, sorry. I think that creativity is definitely there. I think the youth also, and it's not just the youth; it's all of us. We want to stamp our legacy in history. We want to look at the now. It's 2021. So how will people remember us in 50 years' time, 100 years' time? They want to leave that legacy, and the youth want to be part of that. They want to be part of that culture and that creativity.
Yeah. And Reece, coming to you in terms of structural engineering, do you see many young structural engineers really getting into the industry and being keen? I sort of feel like we don't really come across many. Am I wrong? Is there interest?
It can be rare beasts. We're seeing a number of applications. Even this summer, we've had 2 or 3 candidates write to us asking if they can get work experience over the summer. They just want to come in. They want to learn. They want to understand what techniques are being used, what's actually been done in the real world, outside of the academic classroom in which they are currently studying. So yes, I think the pipeline of structural engineers is healthy.
And do you have an answer to the discussion about the circular economy? And if you read Bill Gates's latest book about saving the planet, one of the key culprits, if you like, of CO2 is cement and steel. So do you see young structural engineers really starting to tackle those issues?
They yes, they're all keen on sustainability. They're very much more aware of their impact on their environment, their built environment, and how their actions impact upon the ability of future generations to do it. The idea of sustainability is far more ingrained in their teaching than it was when I was doing my degree 25 years ago.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And James, coming back to you for a second, you described not just the restoration of the building you were involved with, but how that contributed to the local area in that part of Bognor Regis.
Yeah, I think the building in particular was quite a key building on the seafront, and a lot of people have got memories of that building from their own childhood and holidays that they had back in the UK, and seeing it fall to complete disrepair was a bit of a blot on the landscape, and it kind of set the tone for the seafront for a lot of the residents and the neighbours, and seeing somebody finally take the building and try and restore it and bring it back to its former grandeur definitely lifted the locals. And now, they're looking at how other people could do the same thing. Is that hopefully something that's going to encourage other investment in the area, and restore that seafront to the sort of former grandeur that people used to, enjoy in their own childhood. Certainly, that was the feedback from a lot of the local people that would walk past and talk to us, and send notes through social media and stuff like that. And it's quite interesting, Carl's point earlier about the youth coming in and how social media has got its pros and its cons. I've got 2 young kids, and I've noticed during COVID, obviously their uptake on YouTube is a lot larger than I would normally like. And of course, social influencers are a massive thing with children growing up now, and the sort of jobs and what they want to get out of life. And it would be really interesting to try and get more positive influences with those kind of heritage skill sets, so kids can grow up and know that those jobs even exist. I doubt my boys would even know what a stonemason is, compared to a social influencer or something else. So I think, there could be a lot of work through social media that certainly help encourage kids to sort of come into the industry. But yeah, sorry, going back to your point with the Royal, it was definitely a positive feedback for the locals and encouraging other people to do the same.
Yeah, no, good. And Jonty, just continuing the theme of sort of apprenticeships, I think you've had a great success into bringing apprentices into something probably they didn't really know about before. How have you focused?
Yeah, I think very similar to the historic buildings sector, we've got the same issues in the historic motoring sector, where growing market, dwindling skill set, and a lot of these mechanics are located on the farms, far off site, and no future, no training going on for the young apprentices. So what we did, we created a private apprenticeship scheme in partnership with a private business called the Heritage Partnership Agreement, and then we provides us through each year in the first of its kind in the world historic motoring skills academy. So they can then go on to either work at our site, which is a brilliant part of our business ecosystem, but then onwards working internationally, and they've got their accredited degree in historic motoring. So it's hopefully we could do something similar in the historic property sector.
Yeah, it's a very interesting blend, I think, isn't it, of buildings and motoring.
Yeah, exactly that. I think it's old skills that need to be held on to.
Yeah. Good. And Amy, in terms of public sector, if I can come across to you, there's a lot of talk about the construction playbook at the moment and the targets in that for working together, early engagement, sustainability, supply chain, and so on. What are you seeing in terms of an impact on what you're doing coming from that?
Yeah, to be honest, not a lot of change really, because we already tend to employ most of these techniques. So we do spend the large majority of our time in the pre-planning stage before any procurement. So we're trying to outline our scope and our outcomes to ensure that further down the line we won't have any issues. And in our larger projects, we tend to get early contractor involvement as well to work alongside the designer. The contract suite that we use, we tend to use NEC, and this is a real collaborative working approach. So this works really well for both ourselves, either as client or acting on behalf of the client, to work well with our designer, our contractors, and also encompassing like relating this to the public as well, really getting on board their feedback. So they're behind us as well. So I don't think it's really too much of a change, as it is what we are already doing. But I mean, it's nice to have it in writing, as this is what is expected. As I think it will be good, because it needs to be a fair playing field for all, really. And we want to ensure, especially for projects which span over several years, that they are going to reach completion. There's not going to be some sort of big full stop in the middle that's just going to stop it from being completed.
So do you think it goes far enough, the playbook, in what it's trying to achieve?
I don't know, I think it's difficult almost, especially I think relating to heritage and conservation ideas. I think it would be really great for the heritage side if there could be, say, more frameworks, especially with all the specialist contractors in, and even to receive specialist advice, because I know we've had issues ourselves in actually trying to obtain that knowledge, to the point where we created within the local authority a heritage and archaeology framework, so we were able to call off on heritage advice when is required for our projects. If not, it can be quite a timely process, which can delay the projects. So I think having something in place that's more large scale, perhaps across the UK, then that would be great, something that we can draw on a certain skill set from. But then I guess it's also quite difficult with heritage, where often our areas are all quite bespoke. Can you always conform to that guidance? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Rhys, some of the work that you were describing at St George's Tower is pretty intricate stuff, isn't it? I mean, are there enough specialist contractors out there who know what they're doing, for want of a better term? Or are there just a few niche ones? I
don't think there's enough, personally. From my point of view, we've talked about public sector work and perhaps larger projects that are publicly owned, but the big gap for us is some of the private work that we're doing, and being able to recommend firms to private homeowners or to smaller schemes. So maybe local schools got listed buildings that they're trying to maintain, making sure that we've got that supply of tradesmen that we can recommend is difficult.
James, you must have an answer for that as a contractor and developer. Can you find the trades that you need?
No, not really. It's the last 12 months in particular has been incredibly difficult keeping continuity of good trades, because we've been dealing, obviously, like everyone on here, with COVID and trying to keep guys on site, and then obviously the social distancing, and then disappearing. Various furlough schemes. It has made it tricky, and especially with such niche skill sets that we need on some of the projects as well. We've had to really kind of push a lot of our regular guys into really getting to understand some of the kind of slightly more artisan sides of carpentry, if you like, on listed buildings, or the line work with our plasterers. So we've had to really try and kind of diversify a bit with some of the guys that we've got, and try and get them comfortable with using different techniques and skill sets, basically to fill that gap where it's such a small market. And a lot of the people, like commercially, a lot of the people that have got those skill sets, there'll be smaller outfits, and you don't always know when you're going to get them in, because they quite often work on day work. It'll be however many days it takes to get that job. So if you need them in for a specific part of your builds, you've got to kind of plan them months in advance. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but then it's a challenge for everyone. So we just got to, plan for that accordingly, really.
And where do you send somebody to learn about lime plaster or lime mortar these days?
Well, ordinarily we're quite close to the Wood and Down Museum, and they do various courses there that people can do. The last 12 months it has been a challenge. We've been, having to get guys in that would ordinarily do that work, and then they're training up people that they work with on site. But yeah, ordinarily there are courses that you can send out. But say the last 12 months we've had to really kind of work out different ways of doing things, and training people up when the normal kind of face-to-face options haven't been available.
Yeah. And Carl, coming across to you, you have similar issues in terms of getting the tradespeople you need, the specialists?
Yeah, I have to agree with James there. It is very limited at the minute. There's that age-old supply and demand. There could be a lot of projects on, but you don't have the people or skill set to offer to complete them projects.
Yeah.
However, I've probably noticed a big difference between our recession that we had towards the end of the noughties there, to the end of our pandemic in terms of development and training. I did touch on before, but there is a definite change in interest in trades, where the trades probably from 2010 to 2020 probably did drop off, and we did notice it heavily in the industry. Our basic sort of mechanical, electrical, carpentries, even said engineers, there's a big gap. They weren't coming through the relative schooling, training and apprenticeships. Where now we've seen there is a resurgence in that. So it is difficult, but I do believe that there is progress been made even in this last year. And I know I touched on it too, but I think it's down to appreciation of the basic things around us. But touching on James, what he said earlier through social media, we need to take advantage of that. We need to promote on all social media platforms these basic skill sets, these how far and how advanced they can get you in life, and the creativity that it promotes. We want to try and preserve what we can. We want to try and promote what we do, and we want to make progress. So it's all down to learning the skills, but also taking the experience from our generations around us. So before them generations sort of move on, it's taking that knowledge from them. And I suppose one key element, or one of many key elements, is probably in school. So if I sort of focus purely on heritage, it's probably important in the school education programs to teach kids why we're preserved. But I know it does happen, but maybe just an extra development of why we're preserved buildings, the importance of it, and the importance of legacy moving down. So if it starts off in schools, and the appreciation of some pupils may pass through, and that'll have a vested interest in that industry. That will help. Obviously, any apprentice schemes that John T and others mentioned earlier will also help within companies. And that's one thing we do promote within our own companies, is trying to take on as many apprenticeships as possible. And also that sort of, if want for a better word, is the transition probably from moving from traditional to modern, but actually empathizing with both and trying to move forward with both. And then finally, just touching on the individual themselves, I think it's important that there's a broader sort of equality and diversity role here. It's not just singled out to a certain person to develop this skill set, whether it's a stonemason or whatever the special skill may be. We need to broaden the terms out, and probably to finish off that, it is through social media platforms that will help promote that.
It's an interesting one, actually. I think tonight I'm going to Google on. Can you Google on YouTube? I think you Google on YouTube. Don't you? I think I'm going to Google flint napping and lime mortar. I think to see what comes up, because it is true, isn't it? I wouldn't think of going to YouTube. Mind you, I did for some turf laying the other day, but yeah, is there anything on YouTube for lime mortar? It's interesting.
I'm sure there is. There's TV programs now, not necessarily construction related, but I don't know if you've seen that Repair Shop where it's filmed over the world. Well, stuff like that, I think it just opens up loads of, everyone, but especially younger people, into jobs and skill sets they probably didn't even know existed. And yet, that exposure to the satisfaction that you would get from restoring, it might be someone's handbag or whatever, but that same satisfaction goes straight over into these old buildings. And what Carl was saying about leaving a legacy, I don't think there's any better job satisfaction.
Sorry, I think what's also important is that even this last 10 years, even this last year, it's equally as important to take constructive criticism on and our lessons learned, what did we learn from last year? What did we learn from the last 10 years? And bringing that forward and developing it, not just sort of resting on our laurels and being happy and then watching the dying generation move on and the skill set wasted. It's actually just taking the valuable lessons learned and self-promote that and moving forward, with the times.
Yeah. Good. Well, I've got quite a few more thoughts, but we've got 3 interesting questions. So if I read out what the first question and then see who's got some thoughts on it. So this is a question from Luke Bray. Thank you, Luke. And the question is, campaigns such as Architects Journal's Retro First, so that's Retro First, and the importance of whole life carbon assessment, our ability to restore and recycle buildings and their components is becoming increasingly important rather than the throwaway, demolish and rebuild approach. Have you begun to see a growth in traditional restoration skills and new skills related to recycling, creative reuse? I think that sort of almost follows that discussion we've just been having, I think, doesn't it? Jonty, perhaps you'd like to, have you got a thought on that?
Yeah, I think the interesting one we've experienced in that is when we received the site, we had an original conservation appraisal that went through all of the buildings on the site, all of the monuments, and to some extent said, well, there's no purpose for that in the future, and sort of put it at risk and said there's no future. So, but what we were able to do, we took some of the larger buildings, restored them in the first instance, but protected those business buildings. We said, let's not demolish them. Let's work out a future and see what it lies like in 3 to 5 years' time. 3 to 5 years' time, our rentals have grown, and actually now they're viable restoration projects. And we're so grateful now that we made that decision many years back to sort of hold on to those assets and say, whilst not right at this moment have they got an opportunity, the time will come. And we've managed to do that successfully across the site.
I think there's this whole thing, isn't it, about circular economy and actually reusing what we've got. I think it's a huge topic for the future, definitely. And I think almost another question from I think this might be from one of my colleagues, funnily enough, Simon Cash. I did ask them not to ask awkward questions, but a good question from Simon. Which sort of plays along with the YouTube type technology thing, I think, Carl, that you were talking about in terms of social media. So the question here is, for years we've been trying to promote the fact that construction is not just muck and boots, but the drive today in school is about technology and not promoting traditional vocational skills that the heritage sector needs. How can we address this? And I'm going to look at Amy to have a think about that, actually. Do you think that's true? Have we actually moved away from construction being muck and boots? Is it seen more as a sort of a viable future rather than media studies or celebrity status?
Well, yeah, I think so. It's a vocational course, isn't it? Really, I think most youngsters are probably today more inclined to go out to get an apprenticeship to start earning and saving for their future life, rather than perhaps investing the time in going to university to obtain a qualification that way. I mean, certainly from like local government and working with like the Institute of Civil Engineers, we're keen to try and like obtain more civil engineers. So we'll often go out and go into schools at STEM-led events to try and engage youngsters into coming into our industry. And I think we're quite specific in ourselves that we work on coastal structures and how with future sea level rise, climate change, there's going to be a greater need for these construction workers to raise our defences, to protect our land, to enable us to continue living on the coast, which is where so many people want to live.
Are you seeing as well, there's a much, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, there's a much better awareness among school children about the challenges that the Earth and the UK is facing?
Yeah, I think so. It's in the news every day. Well, it was in the news every day before COVID about all of these changes that we are going through. I think it's on people's list. You see all the protests that happen, and those in themselves can be positive, at least drawing attention to the issues that we are facing today. But I think with the construction workers being just muck and boots, I think that image is changing. I mean, personally myself, even just being a woman in the construction industry, that's quite a big step. I would say, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, that would probably be quite unheard of. But us, our team at Coastal Partners, we now have a multitude of young females in the construction industry who are all thriving, and we pass information off onto our friends and our own social media. So we try and bring awareness to all. And I think it's not just the physical dirty work in construction, it's also the research and the theory behind that. So from a heritage point of view as well, I think it'd be great to draw in more specialists who want to work to increase that theory, so that the repairs that we are making, buildings that we are maintaining, they will last for longer.
From our point of view as well, the use of digital construction techniques might be a way of doing this. We restored some 17th century barns using a point cloud scanner, so that we could get a 3D model of the actual timber in place. So we've got a historical record of where it is. We've then used that point cloud to thread in new steel frames to build mezzanines inside the barns. There's all sorts of ways that we can take the new digital techniques and apply them to an old problem and get the benefits from that form of analysis.
Yeah, it's a very good, I mean, and of course that ties in back into the construction playbook and BIM and so on. And I think that's a really good point, Reece, definitely. Okay, final question then, and we've got about 3 minutes left, so we're bang on time. A question from Steve Prowse, and my dogs in the background have chosen to howl at this very second, so please excuse the dogs howling in the background. I did lock them away. But the National Lottery Heritage Fund have a heritage enterprise funding stream where commercial organisations can obtain funds to fill what is known as the heritage deficit. So it's a little bit, the gap funding. And John T, I don't know whether you were aware of that and whether you've been looking at that.
I actually wasn't aware of that one. In my previous life, I did a Heritage Lottery Fund application with the Royal Air Force Museum. So that's certainly now something I need to look at, if that's the case. It is a challenge, I'd say, to try and bring these buildings up to similar standards to what are now becoming the modern day expectations. And certainly what we find is we have typically a lot of our buildings have been brought back into use as workshops. So overheating challenges from the roof lights. Heating, cooling is one of our key challenges in insulation to the buildings. If there was funding available, that would be very helpful. And I think moving more towards a modern fit, it would be great to do, but it's just finding the right design as well, because what you really don't want to do is lose the aesthetics that made this building so special.
We'll certainly have a look at the Heritage Enterprise Fund, because we used it at Chatham Historic Dockyard to turn a very old 18th century building into modern accommodation for businesses, and it's a gap fund. Super. Well, I think
can I just add on to that, Ian, quickly?
Yeah. Just that 20 seconds, Amy.
That's okay. I was just going to say that we're currently working on a little levy bid to try and demonstrate the significance of heritage assets on the coast and the issues that can bring to some of our civil engineering structures, and how there's actually very little funding out there available for us to accommodate these heritage structures, yet we need to implement them and we want to implement them into our schemes. Yeah. So we're going to be looking at the value of these assets and hopefully trying to identify if there are any funding sources out for that and where there are gaps. Hopefully we can share that with everybody.
Great. Super. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so I'm going to wrap up and thank everybody. And please join us at 5:30 for the award ceremony. And thank you, very, very stimulating debate. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon. See you at 5:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.